You introduce yourself first.
Sure. My name is Jeremy K. Simien. I'm a Louisiana historian, art collector, art and antique collector, and I have a special focus on the so-called free people of color and depictions of people of African descent.
Yeah. And I'm Nick Douglas, and I'm the author of Finding Octave, the untold story of two Creole families in slavery, and as well Reclaiming Black History, which is a sort of collection of essays. And again, I write regularly for Afropunk and a couple of other blog spots about race and culture in the United States. So today we're going to talk about two topics, Jeremy, and these are kind of things that we've that have come up in conversations that we've had before. But I think we need to talk about it and maybe help people clarify it a little bit. And the first topic is really Code Noir. Um, Code Noir has about 50 articles that make up the Code Noir. It was created in the 1680s, 1685, to 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 codify the relationship between French settlers, slaves, and free people of color. And I would suggest, and I'll add Code Noir, the pages of Code Noir at the end of this so people can look at it. But I would suggest people look at it because it's really a document that sort of helped form life in Louisiana. Originally, it was set out for Saint Domingue, and of course, we know that Saint Domingue was after the Haitian Revolution, all the French were kicked off, and many of them, many thousands of them, ended up in Louisiana. And of course, Louisiana was a French territory and a Spanish territory. In Louisiana, Code Noir was instituted in 1724. But one of the most interesting things about Code Noir that struck me when I first started looking at it was the first couple of articles. And the first couple of articles were about Jews. And I just overlooked this, I guess, maybe all the times that I've looked at this. But they were basically saying that they wanted the Jews kicked off Saint Domingue. And they did not allow them to be there. And I guess this is a way for the French to have strictly Catholics there. It is it's surprising to me to see this, and what do you say? I mean, it tells a lot about what was going on. And so we know again that the Jews were persecuted on Saint Domingue, kicked off of Saint Domingue, and then that continued on into to New Orleans. So in 1724, Code Noir was adopted in New Orleans, and this is really the time that I know probably your family was coming there. Jeremy, where did your family came from? What Opelousas
Well,
first? Where they?
my family was originally, they've been in the Louisiana Territory. My European ancestors, for since the beginning, they were in Mobile, Alabama, which was then known as Mobile, and they were on Dolphin Island and Fort Toulouse. I think one of my earliest ancestors was born 17 something before New Orleans, but again in the Louisiana Territory.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So they're there in the Louisiana Territory. We know that the French relied heavily on the Native Americans because they were poorly resupplied by the French government. The French government was involved in all kinds of conflicts on the continent, so they relied heavily on Native Americans. And so, Code Noir is a document that tries to codify and sort of control the relationships between French, the white French settlers, free people of color, and slaves. Now, let's be clear about Code Noir. It was not a wonderful thing for slaves or for free people of color, right? There are basically some things in there that say, hey, the a master will be fined if he kills a slave. He
right,
faces a fine. You can still kill your slave, but you're going to face a fine. You'll face a fine
right,
if you mistreat a slave. But what it does do is codify the idea that slavery is not a perpetual state, which is
Right.
one of the things. It does allow marriages between races, which is something that is very, I think a lot of people overlook that. So, and it talks about concubinage, and it codifies the relationship of slaves versus free people, as far as if you have a free father and a slave mother, the child that's born is a slave, right?
Right.
And so again, it tries to control the French in a way. It fines them for having more than two children from a concubine and that kind of thing, just to try to keep them in check a little bit. And of course, out of this came coartation, which is really something that Louisiana is pretty famous for, is that it was this third-party arbitration that slaves could use to purchase their freedom. And during Spanish times, the Spaniards didn't enforce Code Noir as strictly as the French, and so it was a great opportunity um, for slaves to buy their way out of slavery, and they moved into society and became part of the larger society. There was no stigma for having been a slave, as far as I was concerned. So, Jeremy, I know you want to say something, so I'll let you jump in here, Ray.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting with the Code Noir because I hadn't read all of it in a long time, and very often we see reference to it, but we just see single articles as opposed to reading it. As you were saying earlier, it is kind of shocking that the first thing the French wanted to get out the way was, listen, no Jews in this colony, really. In Louisiana, they did not want anyone other than Catholics there. So the Code Noir was almost like their kind of rule book plan infrastructure. And one of the things that's interesting about the Code Noir is it's an afterthought. They had seen colonies, they had seen where they had gone before. They knew what was going to happen. They knew men were going to take up with indigenous ladies and enslaved women and potentially free women, and they knew that there was going to be issues of this. And I don't mean issues of situation, but actually children. And they clearly defined this because they know what's going on. I remember reading your book. One of the things I found fascinating, because I had never seen it phrased like this, but someone visited one of your ancestors and said that he's an outstanding gentleman. The only issue I can bring up is one of his, I forgot how to phrase this. Was it his colonial
His colonial weakness. His colonial
colonial
weakness.
weakness? When you read that, it's so French to phrase something as that, but it also kind of suggests that they knew that this was going to happen in a colony because they'd seen this before. And of course, some of these laws were actually almost ancient. So the status of the mother dictating the child. So whether a child was free or enslaved depended on the status of the mother. So that means that if it was an enslaved father who was the father of a child of a free woman, then the child was free. And if it was a free father, white or black, who had a child with an enslaved woman, her child was still enslaved. From what I understand, that is based on ancient Roman slave law. So it's kind of interesting the French put this together, they slap it together, and they said, okay, we're going to get it right this time. Everything should just run smoothly. Wrong.
We know it
Wrong.
didn't, right? We know.
Right. Loop, I mean, people fully took advantage of everything in this. And of course, they really just had a hard time enforcing many aspects of this, and especially when they kind of relinquished power to the Spanish, which we were talking about in, I think, around 1763, is when this coartation was introduced. But we have to say this: the one of the better that makes the French and the Spanish the better of the evils. Don't get me wrong; it's still a problem, still an issue. You have the institution of slavery and slave trade. Was that they did not see slavery as a permanent condition. And that is not to say that they respected free people of color once they were out of the bondages of slavery. to the degree of equality, but it is to say that they didn't think this was in perpetuity and was going to last forever. And so there were allowances for that, which kind of brings us to maybe a next point of the expression of these people, because I think they did recognize these people as people, whether it was lesser than them or not. That's a whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think
So,
that's up for debate. I think that free people of color certainly had liberties that slaves did not enjoy. They certainly didn't enjoy all the liberties that free whites had, but there was that sort of middle strata that they had,
right,
and so one of the things that sort of will lead us to our next topic was this: is that one of the things that's codified in the Code Noir is that slaves get a day off each
right,
week, right? And
right,
so when you start thinking about that, we know that slaves came to New Orleans very early on in the 1720s. Some of my relatives came around, the enslaved relatives came around 1724 as children. So they grew up with Code Noir. And so they grew up with this idea that one day a week they would have free to do as they please. And they met in public and private places. And very shortly, people started to congregate at the back of city on Rampart, what is now Rampart Street,
right,
and what is now known as Congo Square. And so there were huge gatherings of free people of color and slaves, of course. Slaves were there. But the free people of color lived around Congo Square. They lived around in that area. They lived in the neighborhood that surrounded it. And so there was obviously it was a very unusual thing to have slaves have a day off, be
right,
free to do what they wanted to do, and many slaves used that day to to take in work, to take in lace work, for example, to take in extra work to buy their freedom. Just plain and simple
right,
as that. Other people just used it as ways to enjoy themselves. They were allowed to play music. They were allowed to speak their language. They were allowed to socialize, and congregate in large numbers.
right.
And this is not something that happened. I mean, the colonists, especially the British colonists, were deathly afraid that slaves would start congregating and start conspiring to revolt. So this was a very unusual thing to happen. And so we have a time from 1724 to really about 1817 when the governor or the mayor of the city of New Orleans said, okay, we're designating back of city Rampart Street as the place where these enslaved people can congregate on Sundays. And so that's when it officially started Congo
Right.
Square. So we're talking 1817. This is right after the War of 1812. Think about it. So, and really just a few years after New Orleans or Louisiana became a state. So we have Africans with their language making music. Now were they were very inventive about the instruments that they made. I'm sorry, there's an airplane going over
I
here.
hear
Uh,
that.
that's close. That's close. And so they made homemade instruments. And again, as I said, um, the the free people of color and the town of New Orleans got built around Congo Square. And so there was an interaction between free people of color and the enslaved population that was happening in Congo Square. That was a very unusual thing, and it went on for ages.
Right.
Right?
And even
We're
within
talking. Go ahead.
spectators. I mean, so you even had white people who were coming to see the dancing at Congo Square, to listen to the music. So, but it was really an unusual place in that they were able to essentially reinforce ideas. Newly arrived enslaved people were able to come there, reinforce kind of this what would have been probably lost otherwise, and that's one way that they believe that certain even voodoo and certain aspects of language and culture have remained in New Orleans and Louisiana as opposed to some of the other places. And I think this did relate directly to another aspect of the Code Noir, which was Catholicism. For whatever your beliefs are on it or not, we know that it was a lot more lenient on dancing and singing than some of the other places in the early American colonies, certainly. That were puritanical based. So that's another thing that's interesting, that you have these dances and singing going on that would not have happened in other places. So
Yeah, and just for example, in some British colonies, they outlawed drumming. They figured that drumming was a way for slaves to communicate about rebellions that they were planning, or potential rebellions that they were planning. And so that was not something that happened in New Orleans. They were allowed to drum, and obviously this went on for a very, very long time. But the activity at Congo Square began to decline as the pressure from the lead up to the Civil War started to get ratcheted up in Louisiana.
right,
Right. They stopped having they stopped having these large congregations, and around 1840 or so, it kind of stopped, right? But what we had that came out of out of Congo Square and out of this time with the Creoles of color is the formation of a lot of social clubs and benevolent societies. They were formed out of a couple of different for a couple of different reasons. Some were just simply social clubs or book clubs, literary clubs. There were philharmonic orchestras made up of professional and amateur musicians that played and performed. That again, of course, that's part of the musical tradition that we're talking about now. We're talking about the musical tradition of New Orleans, but when you're talking about these Creoles of color who basically we'll say they were trained to play instruments, played classical instruments, listen to classical music, classically trained. They're being influenced by what's going on in Congo Square, by all the rhythms and innovation that they're doing in African music, obviously.
you see,
That's
professional musicians and professional classically trained musicians interact with people who were, improv and doing improvisational work. And that's interesting in itself, because we see the very, very early origins of what would become jazz. Now, this is pre-war, so but later on we see that develop. Right,
yeah. So we're talking about this happening pre-war, right?
right,
Pre 1860, right? So we see that happen in 1860, and really New Orleans is in a very unusual position during the war, because it's captured. The city of New Orleans is captured in 1862, and General Butler comes in, and he basically frees up the free people of color to have all the rights that they would enjoy as regular citizens, right? He outlaws segregation. Opens up public facilities to everybody, and the white Southerners were upset about this, right? So let's not kid ourselves. They not only did the white Southerners not join the Union Army, which free people of color did. They formed 4 battalions and became the Corps d'Afrique, but they were openly hostile to the free people of color who served and Union soldiers. So there was an interesting sort of situation that was happening in New Orleans that wasn't happening in the rest of the country, right?
right.
And during this time, we have 2 newspapers that are founded by free people of color, and they start immediately writing and advocating freeing of slaves and full civil rights.
Denouncing slavery.
Right, denouncing slavery. So you're talking about this in the Deep South. I mean, the deepest of the Deep South. This is you don't get any deeper in the South than New Orleans. So Very unusual situation. So, um, so then we have the war, right? And we come to the 1870s, and again, like I say, New Orleans, the free people of color are more or less intact. They're not, the city's not destroyed, the countryside around New Orleans is not destroyed, and so they're in a different situation than some of the other cities that are that are in the deep south, like Atlanta and some of these places that are physically destroyed, right?
Right.
So think about it. In 1859, New Orleans has an opera house, right? So it's one of the only places probably in the United States that had an opera house, and certainly one of the only places in the deep south. So not only do you have the classical people that are being trained and playing instruments, you have the innovators and African slaves and former slaves that are not trained but are
Yeah, the influence was all around. I mean, it's kind
influence
of
all around, right?
it's
And you have
extraordinary.
and you throw opera in there, right? Okay,
Right.
and then the other side of this is that because of the situation in New Orleans, and this we want to say it's a unique situation in Louisiana, whites and blacks lived side by side,
Right,
and so
non-integrated. So that's important to know. So because we're constantly trying to explain what makes Louisiana so unique, and people are constantly asking. Well, you even talked about the neighborhood that kind of was kind of went up around Congo Square, which was the Treme neighborhood. It's often called the first black neighborhood, but when in fact it wasn't just a black neighborhood. There were people of color, certainly a large number of them, majority, but there were also whites living next door. So, and same thing with the French Quarter. So you had literally whites, blacks, everything that was coming in the city in between, living next to each other. So it was essentially integrated in some ways as far as neighborhood. I should say it was not segregated. I shouldn't say integrated, but and that's a fascinating place. So essentially, this kind of the lines blurred as far as influence. So even people in the opera house, you could have a free man of color playing classical violin on Friday night, but then by Sunday, here he is doing some improv with someone playing drums, an enslaved person. So this is where that interesting fusion comes along because of the proximity. And we also forgot to mention there were also indigenous people who also would have been in Congo Square, would have been in the French market. So we have all these ingredients just kind of going around, all these moving parts, right? And New Orleans. And that's one of those kind of unusual things, all these parts, but they all seem to kind of fall apart and then reassemble and kind of separate at some point.
it's funny. I'm glad you mentioned the Native Americans because Native Americans were critical to the French surviving uh,
Right.
in Louisiana, and at times they were more powerful than the French. Right, the French were completely reliant on them at certain times. So, but one of the things that happened, I think we talked about this in one of our other videos, was in
Mhm.
1830 there was the Indian Relocation Act, right? And that and literally that act came out of this. It came out of Andrew Jackson, who came to the Battle of New Orleans, and he saw free people of color, Native Americans, French, Spanish, um, mixtures thereof, all coordinating and fighting and really routing the British at the Battle of New Orleans. And they're all giving orders in French, Choctaw, Natchez. I
Right.
mean, and he was like, and they won such a convincing victory that he was like, when he got to be president, he said, "No, we cannot have these. We cannot have these kind of potent coalitions just sitting around, and we certainly can't have armed free men of color sitting in the city of New Orleans, right?"
It
And so
scared
he
him.
said,
It kind of opened his eyes to, whoa, what the hell is going on here? This is not like the rest of the United States. And it wasn't, because it wasn't the United States. Under,
right.
I mean, under the Spanish, very much so. This was almost an island that happened to be attached. Really was what was going on.
And you know something, you brought up a really good point there. It was a foreign country, It was a
Yes.
foreign country, and language, customs, just everything was completely different than the
Right.
rest of the United States. And so, between that time that the Spanish took over in 1763, and then the French sold Louisiana in 1803 to the United States, we had this sort of 30 some odd years or 40 some odd years of Spanish rule, and the Spanish were very laissez-faire about enforcing Code Noir. And so one of the last things that the French prefect of Louisiana did before he turned over Louisiana to the Americans was he reinstated Code Noir. And the reason that he reinstated and sort of reiterated Code Noir was that the French and the Spanish and the white planters that were there were so put off and so upset by the free people of color and the slaves who were just flexing their muscles. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they had a sort of a sense of freedom that was not that other areas of the country just didn't have, and so they were flexing their muscle. They were always pushing the boundaries of what they could do, right? And so they thought it necessary to come and and entreat him to reinforce Code Noir, and so Code Noir became the law of the land again, even though it was in place when the Spanish were there, but it became the land of the law or law of
It's
the
like
land.
it was like a crackdown. It was like, okay, look, things have gotten out of hand here. Y'all may have forgotten about these rules, but let's go over it. Let's do a little review real fast. Things have gone crazy. All of you men cohabitating with all your children, and then all of these enslaved people walking around after night, and all of this. And it's kind of funny because it does slide into, and we talk about in the late 1840s and 1850s. Well, we know by 1841 or so, Congo Square, they pretty much limit the ability for people of color to congregate. And they began to start limiting that. And then it's kind of this slippery slope where free people of color and enslaved people, their rights are all kind of curtailed. And they need walking passes. They can no longer congregate in groups not specified how many people. And so we see that these acts of suppression once fear rises, and really it's really when power's turned over to other people. In this case, the Americans, yeah,
Mhm.
felt very uncomfortable by this.
Yeah, I'm sure the Americans were deathly afraid of what they saw happening in New Orleans on a regular basis. I mean, 1830, I talk about 1830, but it's really a turning point. They try to outlaw the French language. Up till that point, much of the business and bureaucracy that happened in Louisiana was done in French or Spanish, right?
Right.
So the Americans were trying all kinds of tricks and legislation to get control of the situation. And not that Louisiana has ever been a very controllable place, but they did the best.
So,
They tried the best they could, right?
thanks. I had to deal with the U.S. Postal Service today. Look, we can't. We're still rebels. There's still rebels in Louisiana. They still don't conform to anything. It's a joke, but it's kind of true. It's like there's still, we still do things in a signature kind of way here. It's still
Yeah,
laissez-faire in a certain way. So.
yeah. And so I'm laughing about this, and we're sort of laughing about it, but it's really true. Um, and just to point out how intertwined everybody was in New Orleans, especially regarding music. We know that my relatives, many of them were musicians, many of them professional musicians. They were taught by white instructors, and then they taught their children and relatives and loaned instruments to people. So there was a very well developed musical community long. I would say long before we had the word jazz come up, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and the last time we talked about this, you and I we touched on this idea about this art forms coming out of New Orleans,
Right.
and I think I'm gonna let you talk about it, I hope you hit the same point that you did before because it
Yeah,
really struck me.
I think what we were kind of talking about last time is the fact that all of these original art forms and really all of these contributions by people of color seem to always be associated with illicit acts or circumstances that gave birth to this. So we hear over and over again, Storyville gave birth to jazz, but that's just not true. Jazz was played in Storyville, sure, but that's not where jazz was born. Jazz was really, I mean, people have said this. Congo Square was the cradle of jazz. It's where these began, this call and response music, and then this fusion between classically trained Creoles and enslaved Creoles playing, all of these this fusion together, classic, and then this kind of really, I guess, spontaneous and what's the word I'm looking for? And edit.
It's innovative. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah. Mhm.
Just yeah, this kind of improv mixed with this classical, and then we see that interesting rhythmic component come about. So we see that jazz came about after brass bands, of course, and even was facilitated by what you were talking about, which was some of these societies. We see that. So
And even going back to 180, I mean, I think we shared this document. It was a document in 1805. It was for a dance, and they were guaranteeing music and entertainment and refreshment, and it was for free women of color. I don't know if it was not called a quadroon ball.
no,
It was just a dance, and it was at a venue that was I believe was a not a seedy venue. I mean, New Orleans does have some places that were known as seedy places, but there were always a lot of venues that were reputable venues where dances and balls and soirees were held, and because there were so many musicians and musicianship in New Orleans is world famous as far as
right.
that's concerned. So
Well, we talked about this too. So another component that we can say that kind of maybe contributed to jazz as well would be we talked about the Santa Domingue refugees. So we talked about after the declaration of the independent, place of the independent Haiti, country of Haiti, we saw some people end up in Cuba for a time. But then around 1808, the Spanish became uncomfortable with the ideas. 1808, right?
yep, 1808.
Uncomfortable with this large French-speaking population that really kind of didn't fit in, but had been kind of there for years now. And those people jumped ship and went to New Orleans. So we see also this kind of infusion of Afro, we'll say Afro Creole music coming about too. So you have this music kind of pouring in and bouncing off with the people there, and so then we see that's really what the parts the I'm sorry, it was a unique class that kind of exhibited every aspect of humanity under the worst circumstances, which was the institution of slavery.
Yeah, and you see Edmund Day, just for example,
Right.
as a
Exactly.
composer, right? So and of course he goes to France and has a very lucrative career.
Right.
Being a composer in France, he's a very very dark Creole of color, right?
Right.
So we see that. So we'll try to move this on.
Yeah, yeah.
Move
But we
this
got some good
on.
parts to edit.
Well, yeah, we'll cut. We'll cut. So we have Reconstruction in New Orleans, right? And in the South, and so we have this sort of 8 year period where things are changing. The blacks are free, newly freed slaves get the vote. We see black legislators swept into office. New constitutions are made throughout the South to try to bring equity back from sort of the ruins of the Civil War. And and during this period, people come back to Congo Square. They start congregating, and musicians come back to Congo Square. And just around this time, in the 1870s, my relatives who were musicians, who had been sort of in exile in Mexico because of they had left during the pre-Civil War period when things got very, very tight for people of color, start returning to New Orleans, and they're bringing their Mexican influence, Mexican music that they're hearing to New Orleans as well. And in fact, the two relatives I'm referring to, one was sort of comically referred to as the Mexican. So Lorenzo Tio was that was what
Okay.
people called him, right? So they come back and they start forming some of the earliest jazz bands, and they live around Congo Square. They live right adjacent to it, and so now what you have is you don't have enslaved people that are coming there on Sundays, but you have all of course now the newly freed slaves are thrown in with the Creoles of color, right?
Okay.
There's no, I mean, to white society, there's really no difference anymore. I mean, it's the Creoles of color, would like to be considered in a higher strata, but to white America now, they're just another black face.
Right. The
I mean,
lines blurred, and
yeah, that's the
yeah.
way I look at it. I mean, they own their property, they own their land. I mean, they're sort of well off, but that
Their
doesn't really
unique
mean a whole hell
status
of a
is
lot.
fading. Their unique
Yeah,
status of
exactly.
freedom is
Yeah,
fading.
right. And so then we have Reconstruction end, right, and we go right back to Jim Crow and segregation. Um, the
And we've done a video on this before. If you
Yeah, we have
more about
we have
Reconstruction and what happened, we have videos on that. So
yeah
everything kind of just slides back, and in certain ways, it was more difficult for people who were previously free to get along
mhm,
afterwards. So we see Congo Square now renamed, right?
right
So
right
renaming, I think, PGT Beauregard Square.
Beauregard Square, yeah, of course, right.
And so another, now it's like they think it's the final nail in the coffin. And it was for a long time because I don't think it was, while many people knew it was known as Congo Square, it wouldn't be formally recognized as Congo Square again until when? I think,
Till 1970s it was recognized and put down as a historic site. But even before that, there were
oh, yeah.
some attempts to displace Congo Square, and I think that recently that's happened again. But they were building around Congo Square and
Right,
threatening to build around Congo Square back in the 1920s.
right.
They did this. They attempted to do the same thing in the 1960s, right?
And they were
And
successful with the Treme neighborhood, which was that historic neighborhood where people of color were, and it was a really interesting and alive area where black-owned businesses. I mean, people went, no matter what part of town you were from, you would go to Treme to get your special this or special that, or visit that tailor or seamstress. And we know the interstate was put up right through it, and is permanently disfigured Treme.
yeah,
You know,
they put the 10 right, basically right through it, right?
right through it.
And yeah, and so they like I say, they had these attempted disruptions of congregation places, and really to sort of disrupt the neighborhood. I mean, it's a we're kind of revisiting the Tulsa and
Yes.
all these riots and everything like that, but this is a quiet displacement,
This is
right? This is a quiet displacement,
right.
right?
This is urban
Right?
development, is what they call
Right.
it. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Urban
but
renewal is what they tried to call it the other week, because another incident came up recently where they wanted to move City Hall. And of course, that was they were gonna need parking garages to house, I forgot how many cars, but it was gonna again disfigure, and it's for an auditorium that overlooks Congo Square. So again, it's like it's still this place, no matter how sacred or how much history it has, it seems like the powers to be, for whatever reason, maybe not even a cognitive thing, there's still issues with preserving and recognizing Congo Square for what it needs to be, a sacred place and an honored place.
yeah, and we know in the 70s it became this a historical jazz spot is recognized as a historical jazz area, and it gets national recognition.
Right.
It has it's sort of the spot for the New Orleans Jazz Festival. It outgrows the venue,
Right.
right?
The
It
first
becomes too
Jazz
big.
Fest was held in that auditorium. Right.
Right, right. So, despite all the recognition that people in the neighborhood had for it, again, we have this disruption. And I'll sort of throw this in there as well. I grew up I grew up in Oakland, and Oakland had something very similar. They had Seventh Street in Oakland, where people used to go big market, and it was the it's in West Oakland, and it's a thriving black community, and they put the BART tracks through there, right? So it's the same kind of the same playbook. Everything's out of the same playbook, and so what happened when they did this? Now, to me, and maybe I'll get your opinion on this. When they did Seventh Street in Oakland, it basically made it a ghost town. All the businesses got boarded up. This huge BART track goes through it, and it was really the death knell of West Oakland. They used urban development to bulldoze hundreds of houses that were owned by the black community nearby, and they put in a postal uh,
Distribution or something.
distribution, yeah, a postal distribution
Which take
center,
up
right?
tons of space.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I mean, to add insult to injury to this, Jeremy, I mean, they came in with tanks and smashed these houses
True
down. I mean,
warfare.
yeah,
It's warlike tactics. I mean, for real.
yeah, and I have some pictures of it in an article that I did, and it's just what can you say? Now, it seems as though, and you tell me if you feel this way, that the folks in New Orleans have incorporated the 10 into the lifestyle. They have murals and meetings and underneath it. So I'll let you talk about that a
Well,
little bit more.
yeah, and again, I did not grow up in Treme, but I have relatives who were in the neighborhood for in different periods. But I will say that I think that the people who have stayed in that area, and there is a loyal base that is still there, who's been there for multiple generations. They've tried to make the best of it, and they've never given up on that area, and they recognize it as being an important place. But it's going through a difficult time. Like a lot of historic black areas, you had gentrification and you had urban development before gentrification, and these areas were underrepresented politically, and people got away with all kinds of things. And
Hmm.
if we're getting deep here, then after the civil rights movement, where certain aspects of equality are afforded to people of African descent, we see kind of this mobilization of black people who said, well, I don't have to stay in this area where I was once redlined or
Hmm.
trapped in. So I'm going to go to the golf course community. I'm going to go here and there. So that you
Hmm.
have people who stayed behind, and sometimes the people who could not leave. You throw in the American system of over policing these areas, the ridiculous, gratuitous sentencing for drugs. Throw in the crack epidemic, and we see a disruption totally of these areas that were once thriving integral parts of the city and were black owned.
Hmm.
All of those things have limited black wealth, black generation, a lack of have really interrupted the ability for generational black wealth. And now they're trying to move things. They still can't just leave this area be, and or try to facilitate something that would grow the area in a positive way. So it's a messy situation in this urban development. You can call it urban development, you can call it urban transformation, but it seems like it's the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Exactly, exactly. And you know something, Jeremy, you're making reminding me of another point here. In the 1890s, when there was this the idea of renaming Congo Square to P.T. Beauregard or whatever it was, right? There was we hear about Storyville being created, right? and Storyville was there for 20 years, in 1897 to 1917. We have Storyville, right? Sidney Story is the alderman who came up with the idea to put all the illicit, you know, houses of prostitution,
Ill repute.
whatever, gambling houses. I mean, everything was going on there in these 8 square blocks, right?
Right.
And but what people do not know about Sydney's story was this: that 3 years before that, he came up with legislation to make the French Quarter segregated and exclusively white. And when we talk about people losing generational wealth, well, those people, those families who had houses in the French Quarter, who had houses that they lived in for generations.
Right.
I had family members that lived in this house in the French Quarter for 3 generations, maybe 60 to 70 years. They had to sell those houses for pennies on the dollar, and they sold them exclusively to white people, of course. And so it was a tremendous transfer of wealth from the black community to the poor white community,
Right.
who came in. And then you told me something very interesting about what happened after that. Is
Right.
that
So essentially, this transfer of wealth, and you have a bunch of slumlords who pretty much begin to rent to recent arriving immigrants. This would be a large population of Italians. So there's even a book when the French Quarter became Italian. But one aspect that was beneficial is what they call preservation by neglect. No one did anything. Nobody had enough money to get rid of that old door or that old building. So in effect, the French Quarter remained kind of pure and did not change as much as for like what we see in London. You're not going to find historic buildings like you will in New Orleans in many places and other parts of the United States as well. So the French Quarter remained pure and remained as it was because of lack of progress.
right? And so that period, that 1890 period, is an interesting period in New Orleans, and this is why, because it threw the people that were downtown now had to move uptown.
Displaced them. Yep.
Displaced them, right? And so they're crowded into uptown neighborhoods that really previously they never had a whole lot of contact with. And so a lot of people like to say that sort of pressure cooker of segregation sort of accelerated the creation of jazz and jazz bands, because it threw people together that were people who were
French
classically trained versus people who are who can play and who are virtuosos but can play but can't read music and stuff like that. So it threw those people together, right? And so that was sort of this idea that it accelerated jazz. But we know that jazz was already well on its way before 1890.
Right.
Right? So we want to we want to make people, and we want to let them know that the idea that jazz came out of anything illicit or any illicit activities. Yeah, of course, jazz. There's some jazz players that played in honky tonks and speakeasies and all, and whorehouses and all that stuff. We're not going to deny that, but it didn't come out of that.
Right.
Jazz didn't come out of that. Jazz was already happening, and there were so many musical venues and so many musicians that it was inevitable that it was going to happen, and happen long before we ever got to Storyville,
Right.
which is in 1897. So, we want to make sure that I think in these videos that we make, we're trying to dispel a lot of these sort of rumors and ideas about Creoles of color and New Orleans that are just not factual, right? And we're asking people to use their common sense, and as we always say, hey, if you don't believe us, look it up, right?
Right.
So-
We're trying to reclaim black excellence too. Somebody, and this is kind of what you did in your book, Reclaiming Black History. There's so many just bad narratives written, not, of course, not by people of color, but by other people who were in control. So now it's time to tell the stories, and not tell the stories, but tell the right narratives, tell the true story rather. That's what we're trying to do. And we've always said this: you don't have to believe us. You know, look it up. Keep looking up Google, and you will see earlier mentions of jazz and everything else in newspapers and everything else before Storyville. But yes.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think that's something that we can probably end on and just say we'll talk again about this. I think we have an idea for another video coming up, so we'll work on that. And
Okay.
and again, I'll for the folks that are interested, I'll put the Code Noir at the end of this. And I believe I have a picture of a old ancient book of Code Noir
Okay. Okay.
that I'll attach to this, so people can look at an ancient book of the Code Noir. But yeah, I think that we want people to be interested. We want people to look up the information, find their narratives themselves, share their narratives, and again, we always welcome comments, and we'll respond to comments. Anything else, Jeremy?
I think that's all. Just, I will say this last thing. I think that there's more people who come from Louisiana and New Orleans than they realize. I always say that. We're always looking for material culture. Make sure to ask your grandmother, your aunt, your mother. Ask them, do we have any New Orleans relatives? Do we have any pictures? Because we're still looking for a lot of images of important citizens that we've never been able to find. And that's because they traveled. And you may have those in your family album. So if you look tonight, ask grandma, ask mom, ask everybody, and maybe we'll find some history and we can